Assalamu alaikum to the brothers and sisters, and welcome to any other guests. So welcome to the great debate. Thank you for coming on this bank holiday weekend. We know it's a long weekend, and we are grateful that you have attended. And I'm thankful to my respected speakers for attending as well on this bank holiday weekend. So today's debate is our third debate that we've done. My name is Ahmad Uddin. I'm the chairman of the organisation Muslim Community Representative, Camden Islington Association. I know it's a long word, but yeah, we've done this is our third debate, so hopefully it will be enjoyable as the rest of them that we've done. Previous debates that we've done was God v atheism, Islam v secularism, capitalist economics v Islamic economics, and this is going to be freedom and its values. The plan is, basically, we will have Professor Norman, which I will introduce very shortly. He'll be speaking for 15 minutes, his presentation. And then I will introduce Dr. Abdul Wahid, who will speak for 15 minutes as well. And then there will be a 15 minutes rebuttal session, and that should take us up to 8 o'clock, and then we'll break for refreshments and for prayer as well, and then after that we should resume again for the Q&A, which you can all participate. Basically, I also want to remind you, keep the questions and comments afterwards, and we will hopefully presume. And the debate will be, the facilities for the debate, they are stewards, so if you need to know anything, please approach them. Let's begin. On the issue of freedom, it's such a big topic. It's very emotive, and there is a lot of opinions out there. So I'll begin with 3 quotes on freedom to give you the differing views about the issue. George Orwell once said, "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength." Whereas another opinion of freedom, famous by Benjamin Franklin, who said, "Freedom of speech is a principal pillar of a free government. When this support is taken away, the constitution of a free society is dissolved and tyranny is erected on its ruins." And also in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Have you seen him who has taken his whims and desires to be his God?" Surah Al-Furqan 43. So you can see it's such a vast subject with differing views, and we hope from today's debate that there will be a better understanding on freedom and its values. Let me introduce the first speaker. We have with us, thank again Professor Richard Norman for attending. Professor Norman has taught philosophy for many years at the University of Kent, and now is a professor of moral philosophy. He has also written books such as The Moral Philosophers, Ethics, Killing and War. He is the Vice President of the British Humanist Association and is the founder member of the Humanist Philosophers Group. Professor Norman has given many lectures nationally on various issues and has contributed to the British Humanist Association Philosophers website resources as well. So without further delay, I'll ask Professor Richard Norman to speak for 15 minutes on his topic of freedom and its values. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm especially grateful because this is the second time that I've taken part in one of the debates which your organisation has put on. Some of the topics that have been debated previously, especially the first one, are ones where there's perhaps not much chance of agreement, and all that we can hope to do from such a debate is to understand one another better. But I hope that the subject of this debate today is one where we can find some areas of agreement, even if we come to them from different starting points. But I'm very interested to find out to what extent we can explore those areas of agreement. And in that spirit, I want to begin by reminding you of a text in the Quran, which I'm sure you're familiar with, in the second surah of the Quran, the sentence, "There is no compulsion in religion." And I'd like you to think for a moment about why that is the case, why there is no compulsion in religion. I take it that that text is saying not just that there shouldn't be compulsion in religion, but that there cannot be compulsion in religion. And that's because of the truth that you cannot force someone to believe something. You can force or compel somebody to say that they believe something, but you can't compel belief. Let me give you a famous example of that. I'm sure you know of the famous early 17th century scientist Galileo, who was one of the first scientists to defend the view that the Earth is one of the planets that revolves around the Sun. He was criticizing the traditional view that the Earth is at the center of the universe and that the Sun and the other planets revolve around the Earth. And because his scientific position was contrary to the teachings of the Church at the time, he was summoned to Rome by the Inquisition, and he was threatened with torture. And he was forced to sign a confession in which he said, I never have believed, and I do not believe now, and I never will believe that the Earth moves around the Sun. But of course he didn't actually believe that. He signed the confession saying that he believed it. Famously, as he left the Inquisition, he said under his breath, in Italian I think it was, "E pur si muove," but it does move really. Because of course he still believed. He couldn't be compelled to believe what he didn't believe. All he could be compelled to do was to say that he believed something. So that's an important truth, I think, that we can't be compelled to believe what we don't believe. And that's because we all have minds of our own. Again, another way of putting that is that no one can make up your mind for you. You have to make your own judgment about what to believe. You have to make your own choices about what to do. It may be that you believe what you believe because it's what you've been taught as a child and you've never questioned it, but still it's your judgment to believe what you've been told. You may act as you do because someone else tells you to do it, but still it's your choice to do what you're told. So inescapably, we have to use our own judgment and make our own choices. And what that reflects, I think, is a fundamental truth about the nature of human beings, what it is to be human. That as human beings we possess powers of reason and of judgment and of choice. And I'll quote again, if I may, from the Quran, Surah 15, where God says, I fashioned man out of clay and breathed my spirit into him. And I take it that that phrase, I breathed my spirit into him, is a way of saying that human beings all possess, to some degree, those qualities which Muslims would say God possesses to an infinite degree, powers of wisdom and reason and understanding, and although God's possession of them may infinitely exceed that of human beings, all human beings possess something of those qualities. And although, of course, my starting point is different, as an atheist, nevertheless, I also would defend that vision of what it is to be human. But it's part of fundamental to being human that we possess those powers of reason and understanding and judgment and choice, and that we have to make use of them to the full. And that's what I want to suggest to you is the basis of the value of freedom. Because it's grounded in what it is to be human, and it's because we possess those qualities that it's crucial for us to be free to make up our own minds what to believe, free to live our own lives and not have someone else live them for us. That's my starting point there. Now, what does that mean in practice? First of all, it leads to a recognition of the importance of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Your own beliefs, including your religious beliefs or non-religious beliefs, are a vital part of who you are. And it's vital, therefore, that you should be free to express those beliefs, because that's how you express who you are. If you can't express them, if you can't state openly what you believe, then you can't be yourself. So freedom of expression, freedom of speech are first of all of vital importance, because that's the way in which people express their identity, express who they are. Also, freedom of speech and freedom of expression are vitally important because you can't properly make up your own mind what to believe unless you listen to different opinions, unless you hear views that differ from your own, because only then can you judge for yourself if you hear different sides of an argument. You're thinking for yourself only if you listen to the criticism of those who disagree with you. And that's why it's vitally important to have debates like this. You may go away from this debate this evening without changing your beliefs at all. That's quite possible. I should think that probably be true of most people who are here. You may go away with the same beliefs, but I hope that as a result of this debate, you will at least have thought about your beliefs more and thought more about why it is that you believe what you believe. And that's the function of debate, and that depends crucially on freedom of everyone to express themselves in debate and to say what they think. So first of all then, freedom of speech and freedom of expression are vital aspects of the value of freedom. And then secondly, of course, also freedom of action. Freedom to act in the way that we choose, freedom to live your own life in your own way. And that's vitally important because of the simple truth that we're not all the same. People are different. People have different tastes and preferences. People have different skills, different talents, different aptitudes. As your chairman has explained, I've spent my professional life teaching and studying philosophy. And clearly I've done that because, and it's been a great treasure to do that, because that's the kind of activity that appeals to me, but I know it doesn't appeal to everyone. Other people's temperament would lead them to prefer, let's say, a life of physical activity, a life of making things, or a life of athletic activity, or a life of artistic creativity, all sorts of things. People differ. Or again, my favourite way of relaxation is to enjoy the peace and tranquility of the countryside. Other people would find that totally boring and would prefer the excitement of city life. So we're all different, and again the point is that if we don't make our own choices in line with our own preferences and our own temperaments, if you don't live the life that's appropriate for you, then you're not living a fully human life and you're not using to the full your own powers of judgment and choice. As a humanist, I'd put it by saying that if you're not free to make your own choices in life and to live your own life, then you're not using those distinctively human qualities of thought, of reason, of judgment, the ability to choose for yourself. A religious person, I think, would put it by saying that you're not using to the full your God-given qualities of reason and judgment and choice. And again, my point is that though we may have different starting points, I hope that we can agree on it. So, those are two fundamental aspects of the value of freedom. The value of free speech and expression, the value of free action, the freedom to live your own life in your own way. And there are other values that follow from that. The flyer for this meeting, the flyer for this debate, asks, are justice, respect, equality and tolerance the real positive values of freedom? And my answer, of course, is yes, they are. Just take two of those. The value of tolerance. This is inseparable from the value of individual freedom. With the valuing of individual freedom necessarily goes the valuing of tolerance. Because if I value the freedom to live my own life in my own way, if I value the freedom to hold my own beliefs, then of course the other side of that is that I should also value the freedom of other people to live their own lives and to hold their own beliefs which may be different from mine. So again, tolerance is another aspect of the acceptance of diversity, the acceptance of the fact that people differ, people hold different beliefs, people have different ways of life, and you can't force everybody into the same mold. So the value of tolerance is crucially linked to the value of freedom. And then secondly, the one I want to focus on from that list is the value of equality. And again, that's inseparable from the value of freedom, I think. Because as I've been trying to explain, the value of freedom is rooted in the fact that we all, as human beings, possess those qualities of thought and reason and the capacity to choose. I've said that that's part of what it is to be human, and that's why those are qualities possessed by all human beings. Not just some groups and not others, but by all human beings. By all ethnic groups, therefore. And that's why the struggle for liberal values, the struggle for freedom, has always been also a struggle for racial equality. Equality is possessed also equally by men and by women, and that's why the struggle for liberal values has also been the struggle for sexual equality. So those values of tolerance and of equality are inseparably linked with the value of freedom. Now, at this point, I want to remove what might be some misunderstandings of what I'm defending when I defend the value of freedom. First, I'm not saying that freedom is the only value. Freedom, as I've been arguing, reflects the fact that we're individuals, with minds of our own, with lives of our own. But we're not just individuals, of course. We're also, all of us, members of a community, and there are values, the values of community, which are just as important as the value of freedom. We're not just individuals, we're also social beings. We depend upon one another. Our lives are enriched by our relations with one another. Our family relationships, our relationships to our friends, our relationship to the wider community. And so with the fact of community go other values. Values of kindness and compassion, the value of cooperation, the value of shared activity, doing things together and working together. The value of tradition, the importance of drawing on a tradition which we inherit from previous generations and which we pass on to our children. Though we have to make up our own minds and form our own beliefs, we can't just do that in a vacuum, out of nowhere. We do it by drawing on the resources of the tradition and the community which we inherit. So without that shared community, the values of freedom would themselves be impossible. We only possess powers of thought and reason and judgment because we've learned how to use them. And that's why also then education is crucially bound up with the relationship between community and freedom. We can't take responsibility for our own lives, we can't think for ourselves unless we're taught to do so. One of the most inspiring events of the past year, I think, was the speech which the Pakistani girl Malala Yousafzai gave to the United Nations back in July, in which she talked inspiringly about the importance of education for everyone, for boys and for girls. She was the girl, you remember, who was shot by members of the Taliban in Pakistan because she stood up for the value of education for girls as well as for boys. And I think that what she stood for there, in that speech, which she gave as a Muslim woman, is a speech which brings out how the values of freedom and equality and education are so closely linked. So that's the first misunderstanding that I want to head off. The values of freedom are not the only values. And that talk about community brings me also to a second misunderstanding which I want to clear away. Because when I defend the value of freedom, I'm not just talking about the value of doing whatever you feel like doing without any concern for others, without any concern for consequences. If we value freedom, then as I've said, we have to value other people's freedom as well. And so we have to set limits on our own freedom to stop us from depriving other people of their freedom, and that's why we need laws for this. That's why we need laws to prevent people from killing one another and using violence against one another and stealing and inflicting serious harm on one another. Those restrictions are necessary. Restrictions on our freedom are necessary to protect the freedom of everyone. But I also want to add to that it's not a good idea to put too much reliance on laws and restrictions. It's much better if, as far as possible, people take responsibility for their own actions. People need to recognise for themselves the need to set limits to their own freedom of action. And of course it's difficult to get the balance right. Let me just give you one example. I'd like to see stricter limits, stricter legal limits on the sale of alcohol. I live in an area where there are a lot of students and people in the area are often disturbed and woken up between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning by students coming out of the clubs much too inebriated and shouting loudly and waking everybody up. And that's an example of how alcohol fuels violent and disruptive behaviour. But at the same time, I wouldn't want to see a complete legal ban on the drinking of alcohol, partly because I like a glass of wine with my meal, but also because it would give the state too much control over people's lives. So we have to be though there have to be limits to freedom, we need to be very cautious about looking to the state and the law to set those limits as far as possible. People should take responsibility for controlling their own freedom. One last point I want to make before I finish, because I'm conscious that I'm already over my time, I think. So just a couple of more minutes. One last point I want to make. We need rules and laws, I've said, to prevent some people's exercise of their freedom from causing harm to others. And I emphasize that word harm there. Harm is harm, and harm is not the same thing as offence. I don't think it's acceptable to restrict people's freedom, either their freedom of action or their freedom of speech, simply because we're offended by what they say or by what they do. There are some groups, including some Muslim groups, who do and have tried to stop people doing things, or stop people publishing things, or stop people giving things out because they say it's offensive. But if we tried to ban or restrict everything that we're offended by, that would be the route to tyranny. There are all sorts of things that I'm offended by, but I wouldn't want to ban them. Once you start on the route of banning everything that offends you, you're on a very dangerous path, because then free inquiry dies out, independent thought dies out, debate and discussion become impossible. If we all tried to ban things that offend us, debates like this would become impossible. So I hope you agree then that debates like this, in which we're all free to say what we believe, are vital for a good human life and a good society. I look forward now to hearing what Dr. Waheed will say about that same question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Norman, for his presentation on freedom and its values. Now I will introduce the next speaker. Speaker's name is Dr. Abdul Waheed. He is currently the chairman of the UK Executive Committee of Hizb ut-Tahrir Britain. He has been active in the UK Muslim community for over 15 years and by profession works as a medical doctor. He has written and spoken on political and social issues and is a regular contributor at the online political affairs site New Civilization. He has written for the Times Higher Educational Supplement and for websites such as Foreign Affairs, Open Democracy and Prospect Magazine. Plus, he has appeared on national and international media channels discussing many different issues affecting the Muslim community. So I'd like to call Dr. Abdul Waheed to give a speech for his 15 minutes on the presentation of freedom and its values.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good evening. I start in the name of Allah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the most kind, most merciful, and I seek His blessings and prayers upon the final messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. It's the archetypal stereotype of an Islamic fundamentalist that he hates all freedoms of this society. I hope I don't disappoint anyone this evening. Actually, the debate is a lot more nuanced than that. What Professor Norman has just set out is actually the classical European, Western, American view of freedom and its positives. And it's worth remembering that that view comes from a particular European experience, that for many hundreds of years there was conflict in Europe about religion between different aspects of Christianity, Protestants and Catholics, and it was mixed up with a power struggle between the Catholic Church and the kings and princes in Europe, and it was a particularly bloody power struggle, which ended up being settled by a treaty in 1648, where it was decided that states wouldn't interfere in the politics of other states, and the head of state could choose which aspect of Christianity, Protestant or Catholicism, would be the dominant faith in that society, and that other branches of Christianity should be tolerated, because up till that point, if you followed the wrong branch of Christianity in your state, you'd be killed or you'd be persecuted, you wouldn't be allowed to express your religion. And as Professor Norman said, when people, scientists like Galileo, used to present ideas and they conflicted with official church doctrine, people were oppressed and silenced. And when others conflicted with the authority of the church, they weren't allowed to account. Accounting political authority was tantamount to challenging God, because it was challenging the church. So what Professor Norman, what Richard has set out, is actually the position that thinkers came to try and reconcile these conflicts so that people could live with each other peacefully, harmoniously, without killing and fighting and bloodshed. And I suppose we would say that, in that respect, we recognize that that's what everyone wants, whether it's an atheist humanist or a practicing Muslim, anyone. Actually, what people aspire to is to actually live decent lives, isn't it? To fulfill their human instincts, their human needs, as best as we can, and live side by side with each other. So this approach, which European thinkers and philosophers came to settle their conflicts in Europe, was their way of doing that. I come from a different tradition, and I think it's worth remembering here that actually what we talk about as being a universal value and a universal thing is actually not universal, it's peculiar to the European experience. This experience you will not find in ancient China. This experience you will not find in Africa, you will not find in the Islamic world. They have different histories. Europe had this particular history which led to this particular solution. I think the solution itself, in theory, whilst you can hear and even you can see in society, it meets some of its aims, is theoretically even flawed in the sense that actually we know that. We know, I know people argue there's any such thing as absolute freedom. Absolute freedom means anarchy. If I'm free to do whatever I like, and I don't really give a damn about the consequences, if I don't take into account community and tradition and the things that Richard has mentioned, then actually we're going to have a pretty chaotic society where people's freedoms clash with each other. So nobody really argues that there's any such thing as absolute freedom. And in fact, really what the argument ends up being is, what are the limits to those freedoms? And who decides them? That's actually what the theoretical things ends up being. What are the limits to freedom? Because everybody agrees there'll be limits to freedom. Even the French. Yeah, everyone agrees there'll be limits to freedom. But who decides that? Is it God? Is it the church? Is it a government, an elected government, a king, individuals themselves? Who decides that? And that's what the debate ends up being about. In practice, I think there are three really big problems that I see with the European way of approaching how to get a better society. And I think these are not intended problems. Nobody who thought these things through intended these problems. One are the unforeseen harms that come from arguing about freedom, in particular from the point of view of the freedom of the individual. The other is the various contradictions you see in the way that those freedoms are played out in society. And the last is the way that freedoms used as a political tool. Okay, so when you see the unforeseen harms, I think it's fair to say, if you take Europe several hundred years ago, with its various intolerances, with its wars, with its bloodshed, with its lack of thought and shrinking of the church, and when they adopted these ideas, nobody can dispute the fact that there was a renaissance in thinking. Nobody can dispute the fact that there was more tolerance in Europe after that. Nobody can dispute the fact that there was a industrial revolution and technological advancement. Now, what you can dispute is how much of that came from the freedom, because actually, you know what? There was technological advancement in the Soviet Union. There wasn't much freedom there. 1917, that Russia was a largely peasant nation, which didn't have much technological gain. By 1949, they had a nuclear weapon, and by the 1950s, they had a man in space. Okay, and that wasn't because of freedom. Ancient China had huge amounts of philosophical ideas. They invented paper, they invented gunpowder, they invented the compass. So, you know, that was not synonymous with the European model of freedom. And we know in the Islamic history that the Bedouin Arabs, within a few decades, came to rule over a civilization with order, with justice, with technological progress, with great thinking, with education, and we saw all of that in the Middle East. And that's not associated with the Middle East model, the European model of freedom either. But there are these excesses that I mentioned, and they are there, and they were not intended, but they are there. And what can those excesses be? Well, actually, you know, we see them day in, day out. Richard mentioned students in his hometown that may drink too much and be a bit reckless. But you know what? The freedom to drink alcohol causes far more problems than that. You're talking in the region of 8,000 deaths a year, 1.2 million hospital admissions, 2.5 million children that live in households where parents drink hazardously, and about 500,000 children, 700,000 children, where we live in households where the parents are alcoholics in a country. Now, if I was to introduce a substance into the market today with that track record, it would be never allowed to be licensed and free. Similarly, gambling, the freedom to gamble, which is something which is a free restriction, currently has approximately, according to NHS websites anyway, about 500,000 addicts in this country, but earns the exchequer taxes from its £2 billion of revenue every year. The freedom to trade in pornography contributes, and sexual freedom contributes to huge problems in the social fabric of society. You know, this is a very sexually permissive society. Some people would say that's great, right? But the net result is that about 35,000 women in England and Wales are raped every year. And 1 in 5 women in this country has experienced some form of sexual assault in their lifetime. These are not easy things to answer. And one of the problems I've seen in society here is that when these problems, which actually come from the unforeseen consequences of freedom, emerge, nobody but nobody wants to roll back those freedoms and say, look, you know what? X is the cause of the problem, and therefore we have to stop X in order to solve it. It's all about firefighting and mitigating problems. And there's never an acknowledgement. Because actually, why? Because freedom is held as sacrosanct. What it shows to me is that actually, once upon a time, what it shows to me is everybody in society, everybody in every time and period of history is a slave to something, right? Everybody's a slave to something. Once upon a time in Europe, people were slaves to the church, and the church decided what was sacrosanct. Actually, nowadays, people are slaves to the market. That's what's happened. Because you know what? In the end, who decides those limits is the one with the most power. And in today's day and age, the ones with the most power are the alcohol lobby, the gambling lobby, and any other lobby that can influence what laws are made to impact on those freedoms. I want to say something about Islam, really, because it's important to say we approach this in a very different way. Richard mentioned this distinction between, this conflict, this tension between, this balance between the individual and society. And Islam recognizes that as well. It recognizes human beings are individual human beings, accountable before God, before their actions, allowed to do things themselves, but it recognizes you're part of a community, part of a society. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he mentioned this in one of his hadith, one of his sayings, that he said the example of people is like people on a boat, some of whom occupy the upper deck and some of whom occupy the lower deck. And whenever those on the lower deck need water, they have to go to the upper deck to get the water. And if some of them said, why don't we make a hole in the boat to get the water directly from the river underneath us? Wouldn't the people in the upper deck do something about that to stop them? He's saying, wouldn't that mean that potentially the actions of a few can impact the whole collective actions of the whole society? And Islam recognizes this distinction between individuals and society. And whilst Islam sets parameters and limits, as every system sets limits, and within those limits, the people are free, really, to act as they will act according to those limits, and that's the same for everyone. It recognizes the rights of society more than the rights of the individual. But it actually does many other things as well. It's actually, I would argue, actually, the body of Islamic law is much smaller than the body of statute law in this country. It's massive. The laws in this country, massive. They've accumulated over hundreds of years. There are lots of laws, and many of them are to mitigate the harms caused by other laws. You've got laws trying to solve the problems of previous generations' laws that have been made. Islamic law, because it's revealed law, is fairly fixed, but it's there. And within that framework, people live their lives as families and communities. Trade happens within the laws of the market and the trade of the market. Pretty much free trade within that. It's got fewer restrictions than the regulations in the markets here. But there are a few important laws which actually solve some of the problems that I think that have conflict in the society, because there's always this worry in Western society that if you restrict people from saying what they want to say somebody wants to insult somebody and I restrict that, well, that's the thin end of the wedge. That's opening the door to stopping somebody accounting the powerful. Right? Islam makes a very clear distinction on this. It doesn't allow me to backbite people, slander people publicly. It doesn't allow me to wantonly insult other people's sanctities and faiths. At the same time, Islam obliges its community to account its political authority. The Prophet ﷺ, when he was talking about his beloved uncle Hamza, radiallahu anhu, he said the master of martyrs is Hamza, who was killed in battle. And a man who stood up to a tyrant ruler and ordered him to do good and forbade him from doing evil, and then was killed by him. And he said the best jihad is the word of truth to the tyrant ruler. So Islam makes a clear distinction between accounting the political authority and cheap gossip. It's the distinction between the tabloid press and investigative journalism, challenging journalism, holding account to power. Islam makes a very clear distinction between what happens in the public sphere and the private sphere. They used to say an Englishman's home is his castle. Well, today, if a Muslim is teaching orthodox Islamic doctrine to his children, he can actually be holed up in front of social services for extremist culturing of his children, whether he does it in a home or in a school or whatever. There's a famous incident in the time of the second Caliph of Islam, Umar ibn Khattab, where he entered somebody's house to account them for drinking without knocking, without taking permission to enter. And actually the ruling on that was that he was not allowed to take authority in dealing with something which was prohibited in that society because it was in a private space and he couldn't enter without permission. Islam makes this clear distinction between public and private. So what happens in private is not the business of the state, even though it may be a sin according to Islam. My time is up, and I'm sure we'll come back to many more issues. It's a very difficult subject to cover in 15 minutes, and I think I've probably opened more questions than answered. Thank you very much.
So now what will happen is Professor Norman will rebut Dr. Wahid, and then it will be vice versa. So I'll call Professor Norman to come to it.
Thanks very much, and as I hoped, I think we have both areas of agreement and areas of disagreement there, and I'll try to say something about both before we break. First of all, about the historical point. Abdul Wahid said that the view of freedom that I was defending was a geographically and historically limited one. He described it as the classic Western view, which he traced back to the end of the religious wars of the 17th century. I think it's broader than that. What you can do is trace a certain kind of secular political order to that historical period. But the view that of freedom, the value of freedom that I was trying to defend is wider than that, and I think it's exemplified in a much broader historical context. That emphasis, for example, on critical debate and argument is one that goes back to the ancient world, of course, where in the ancient Greek world, for example, the ancient Greek philosophers like Socrates were a model of the attempt to get at the truth by speaking freely and through dialogue and debate. And that tradition was also, important to recognize, picked up, especially by Islam in the period roughly from the 9th to the 12th centuries in North Africa, in the Middle East, in North Africa or in Spain. The great period of Islamic science, again, was picking up that tradition from the ancient world and flourishing in a way that European society wasn't. And it's that same tradition, I think, that's then picked up later on by the Enlightenment in Europe. So it's a much broader tradition, I think, than just a Western position over the last few hundred years. What I've been trying to argue is that it's a tradition and a set of values that's actually rooted in something that's universal about human beings. But of course it's right that it's, those values are much more to the fore in certain historical periods, but they're much more than just Western Europe in the last 200 or 300 years. I want also to, on the historical question, to make it clear that I'm not equating the view of the value of freedom that I'm defending with ideas about the free market and free trade. Abdul Wahid raised the question of the Industrial Revolution and whether that was a product of freedom. Well, it was a product of a certain kind of freedom The Industrial Revolution in this country and other Western European countries depended on breaking down the old privileges of the guilds and allowing, which were very restrictive on what kinds of trades people could go into. So the breaking down of those restrictions, the liberalisation of the ability to trade and exchange was a part of the Industrial Revolution, but that's something much more limited than the value of freedom that I'm talking about. And when I defend freedom, I'm not defending the economics of the free market. I want to make that clear, because as Abdul Wahid himself said, what the economics of the free market so often does actually is to concentrate power in the hands of big corporations, powerful people who are then able to exercise much more influence. So it's not the free market, not free trade that I'm defending. I'm defending something much more fundamental and much more important, much more general than that. Now, I agree with Abdul Wahid that the argument is not about absolute freedom, and I made that clear earlier, I think, and I think we agree about this. Absolute unlimited freedom would be anarchy, and so the real argument is about what the limits of freedom are. And the main point that I want to emphasize, and I'm repeating what I said earlier, but I want to say it again, is that although, of course, unlimited freedom is not acceptable, we have to be very wary about the idea that the best way to limit people's freedom, to prevent harms, is by preventing them from doing things, and in particular by legal restrictions. Let's go back to that example of freedom to drink alcohol, which I mentioned, which Abdul Wahid talked about as well. Agreed, it's a problem. I have no hesitation in agreeing with him about that. But as I said earlier, it's not a problem that can be solved simply by banning alcohol legally or socially, preventing people from drinking. Just look at historical experience on that. That was tried, the famous era of prohibition in America in the 1920s. It was a complete failure because, of course, what it did was just to drive the alcohol trade underground. That was what led to the power of the criminal gangs in Chicago and so on, and the black market in alcohol. And I have to say that we find the same thing in Saudi Arabia at the moment, where alcohol is legally prohibited, but actually anybody can get a drink, provided they're prepared to make use of smuggling and the black market. So just trying to solve the problem just by bans and restrictions and legal restrictions doesn't solve anything. And what it is a failure to encourage people to take responsibility for their own lives. Now, we then get down to a difficult argument as to what the right balance there is. And I agree, it's about where you set the limits, but also about how you set the limits. But simply banning things is not the answer. And that's the same point also that I want to make about freedom of speech, and this is the last point that I want to pick up from what Abdul Wahid said. He said that Islam doesn't allow me in making use of my own freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Islam doesn't allow me to slander or insult other people. And I agree, it's not a proper use of one's freedom of speech to use it to insult or to slander people or to ridicule. Good debate depends upon respect, listening to other people. But I also want to say that you can't ensure that just by banning people when they insult or slander or fail to show respect. If you do that, then, as Abdul Wahid himself said, and I think this is crucially important, it's the thin end of the wedge. Yes, good debate, good use of freedom of expression depends on people being respectful, listening to one another, debating in a civilized way. If people fail to do that, then that's the price that we have to pay for the value of free expression. But if you try to deal with people's abuse of free expression by silencing them, then you're on the road to tyranny, and that it's vital to avoid. Thank you very much.
Now if I call Dr. Wahid to speak for 10 minutes.
the universality question, I think there's going to be a bit of a difference on this. I've lost my quote. My papers are a mess and they're not even printed properly. But I've lost my quote, but I have a quote over there somewhere in those papers from Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis is no friend of Islam. He's the professor of, I think he's a professor of something at Princeton, international relations or history. I'm not sure which of the two it is. He's a big, he's beloved of the neocons in America. So he's not very like friendly towards Islam. But he himself argued that in one of his books that actually the European, the freedom in its secular manifestation in the world is a peculiarly European thing. And that's one of the reasons why, when this argument comes to the Muslim world about applying its limits within the Muslim world, it doesn't actually sit very easily, because it doesn't sit with the Islamic tradition. As I've said, Islam draws a very clear distinction between intellectual inquiry, debate, discussion, accounting political authority on the one hand, and it has a strong tradition of that over centuries, against insult, slander, and in particular, insult of Allah and His prophets. And here I think I would argue, I would defend strongly a society that is built on that. I'll give you one example. In today's society, it is increasingly common that people complain of a culture of disrespect. Disrespect between people on the street. Disrespect from a young person towards a police officer. Disrespect from a pupil to a teacher. Disrespect of children to parents. It's one of the things associated with what they call broken Britain today, the culture of antisocial behaviour. Britain, historically, is a Christian country. It's a Christian country. People in Britain either respect Jesus, alayhi salam, Isa alayhi salam, as a prophet or a son of God, or even those people who are not Christian, people who are atheists, will even say, you know what, this guy is considered to be a good guy. His moral code of conduct was good. And actually, a lot of atheists will say that's not a bad code of conduct that's attributed to Jesus, alayhi salam, that we should follow. But actually, because of this rebellion against the church with its authority, everything was fair game. Even insulting Allah, even insulting God, even insulting His prophets and Jesus. And when you take the things that are most dear in society and you make them fair game to insult, don't be surprised if later on people just make fair game anything else. Starts with your sanctified figures in society, and it will end up with child, with parent, student, with teacher, and so on and so forth. And I really believe one of the problems you have in today's society is because there is this freedom to insult, and people say no one has the right not to be insulted. And whilst I actually do agree with Richard that actually the starting point of this should be a civility which is ingrained in people, the starting point of this should be that Islam gives limits, okay? And so much of Islamic tradition, when you understand it, starts from the point of view of the individual fearing his Lord, fearing individual and personal accountability and taking responsibility for their own actions. The second thing in Islam is the relationship between the community. If I do something which goes against the grain of Islam, I should expect that my peers and the society around me would shun me for that. So there is, if you like, a balance within society because of what people worry about, what other people think of them. So there's something which you're taught in the home, taught in the classroom, a consciousness with which you behave with, and a public opinion which you respond to. But then on certain limits, Islam puts these limits. We call them the hudud of Allah. And these are the limits. These are which Islam fixes with punishments sometimes in an Islamic society, under an Islamic state. And those become limits which people don't go near. So it's very clear. And whether that is an insult of God and his messengers, whether that is on even things like adultery, whether it is things like drinking alcohol in the public sphere. And actually I'd say, you know what, when we talk about these things, think about them in the public sphere. Because although there are always sins in Islam, right, the extent of the state and the law is only in the public sphere. It is not in the home. So somebody's committing a sin in the home, it's still a sin. But the extent of the state and the law does not allow it to spy in the house or enter into the house freely without permission. And these things guard the limits of a society. And these things, if you like, are not the only things you rely on. These are, if you like, they are the last things, the linchpin of the society. But they are not the only things. Rather, it starts from the home, it starts from the teaching, it starts from education, it starts from the morals which are generally held within the society. And this is a very big difference, I think, when we follow the idea that man is an individual and actually his individual rights come above anything else. Don't be surprised if somebody wants to freely express himself by being racist on the football terraces. Don't be surprised when somebody wants to freely express himself by intimidating little old ladies in the high street on a Friday or a Saturday night. Because they'll think that's their individual right to do that. And when you ask them, why do you think that? They'll think that because it's an actually all-pervasive thing in the society. It comes back from a doctrinal thing in the end. And nobody wants to argue that actually, you know what, sometimes there has to be some checks and balances. Even I would argue that this idea, even if we take it outside of the law, where is the body of opinion in Western society that argues in a strong way that people should behave themselves and censor themselves and behave with civility amongst each other, as Professor Norman is saying they should, without going to the law? There is no body of opinion like that. There is no body of opinion that is actually out there in the society. Why? Because it contradicts the very idea that I should be free to do what I want. And when people insult the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Muslims raise their voices and say we don't like that, all too often we hear, well, you have no right not to be offended. And more offensive things are usually said in order to make it clear that actually nobody has that right not to be offended. And as I say, I wish there was this understanding that actually this actually stems from this doctrine. And it's one of the flaws in this doctrine, which I don't see people wrestling with often enough. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to take a consensus. Prayer break is at 8:07. So do people want to ask any questions now, or do you want to break and come back at 8:30? We do have drinks as well after the prayer. Up to you guys. Let me see. What do you want to do? Do you want to take a few questions now? Pray break, yeah? Okay. All right then. So that gives time to do the break. Brothers will be praying at the back behind us. Sisters will be in here. Both the toilets are on the right side. Stewards will be around to guide you. Space is quite limited for the brothers, so they might need to pray in about 2 or 3 sittings or so. Okay? So we should be resuming back here at 8:30. And I would like to thank those that came actually on time on 6 o'clock. I do appreciate and thank you for your patience. And we really appreciate you coming back after the salah to ask questions to our panelists. Thank you very much.